Well, good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. I'm Ruth Shelley, president of the Rotary Club of Portland. Welcome to our live weekly membership meeting. This year's theme, as you know, for Rotary International is Rotary Opens Opportunities. Yes, Rotary opens opportunities to find solutions for today's challenges, healing from the pandemic, recovery from the economic downturn, and peace building as we seek racial justice. This week, we open a double door, healing and peace building, as we hear from Colin Fogarty about the Confluence project on the Columbia River. But first, let's welcome Rotarian Drew McHenry-Williams for our reflection. Drew?
Hello, all. A couple things I want to do with reflection. One, show how easy it is for any of us to do it so that we increase participation. I think the ingredients are some thought or statement that inspires you, and tie at least one thing about yourself into it. So there's a quote I'm going to say, and only one, and just say a little bit about it. Knowing that I think we don't do enough reflection in our country, and we'd be a more peaceful, healing place if we did so. The other thing, for those of you that don't know much about me, is I am a mental health and substance abuse professional. So mental health is always on my mind in some way, shape, or form. So the quote is from Janine Roth. It's not the wound or wounds that shape our lives. It's the choices we make as young adults, as adults, between embracing our wounds or raging against them. So there's so many things you could do with that. I think it's tough when I think about some of the abuse I went through, physical and sexual abuse as a kid. And I think my first helping professional didn't have this quote in mind, but she modeled and helped teach me how to do just that, to embrace what had happened, get the support I needed and didn't get back then, and move through things, go through the hell, if you will, to be able to move through it, as opposed to unaware and suffering needlessly and longer than I needed to. So with that, there is a lot of wounding that's going on, and relationships that are struggling. So consider Janine Roth's inspirational quote. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Drew. All important for us to remember, and I will embrace my mistake in mispronouncing your last name. Of course, you're Henry McWilliams, and I turned it around, but I know who you are. We all do. And if you'd like to volunteer to give the reflection, as Drew said, it's very easy. Siobhan has the link in the chat, or you can email her directly. Now I'd like to ask that Rotarians who have invited a guest to raise their real or virtual hand, and Corinne will call on you to unmute and introduce them. Or if you're a visiting Rotarian who came on your own, please raise your hand and introduce yourself, or let us know of your presence via the chat box. Corinne, do we have any guests today?
I don't see anybody. Am I missing anyone? You can go ahead and unmute yourself if I do.
It seems that we have all familiar faces. If anyone joins us in the course of the meeting, we will be sure to welcome them. And for a couple of days yet, it's still March. I'd like to extend a happy birthday to everyone with birthdays this month. We alternate each week honoring birthdays and Rotary anniversaries. Please note the birthdays here of these wonderful spring babies and reach out to our fellow Rotarians with many happy returns. Happy birthday all. And now a quick announcement that Rotary District 5100 training is coming up next month in April. It will once again be virtual this year and done across 2 weekends, Saturday, April 10th and Saturday, April 17th. Siobhan will put the link to the details in the chat. Now, district training is something we especially encourage new members to participate in, and those members who want specific information on other aspects of club operation. Please check out the agenda of sessions for the breadth of topics. There's lots of interest, and reach out to Siobhan or Corinne if you need help registering online. The good news is that training is free, and so please use this wonderful resource. Now, please welcome Mari Bunich to talk about this month's Committee of the Month, Enterprise Academy. Mari?
Thank you, President Ruth. As you've been hearing over the last few weeks, Enterprise Academy, which normally would have just taken place in person, is going virtual, like so many things this year. In addition to creating that online experience for our students, we're working really hard on some of the backbone and structure of Enterprise Academy, clarifying our mission statement, focusing on training for our counselors, which any of you could be next year if you want to come and join us and help some high school students learn about business. And honestly, I learned a lot about business myself attending last year. If anybody is interested in joining us, there's a plethora of options, from being a counselor when we're back at in-person trainings to being a speaker as a CEO, CFO, marketing expert, whole range of options. And we also invite our Rotarians and business owners to come and listen to the business speeches, to the presentations that these students give. It gives them a little more experience and a little bit more of that sense of having to talk to somebody you don't know and giving that speech in front of them. So I know you will all be astounded by what you hear from these students in the future. And we would love to have anybody who's interested in joining us or speaking with us, please email me and I'll put my info in the chat box, and we can make sure to either get you engaged this year with our virtual event or next year when we're back in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Maury. I especially am glad that you pointed out how much we as Rotarians learn in the course of Enterprise Academy. And now we're going to disappear and enter a virtual table talk. Please introduce yourselves to the others in your group. A minute or so before you come back to this main meeting, you'll get a visual heads up. And I have a suggestion for a topic of discussion. If the conversation flows, you're more than free to chat about whatever you like. But if you get stuck, perhaps you could think about your favorite memory of an experience on the Columbia River. Here we go. I'm so looking forward to our program today. And after our speaker is finished, if you'd like to ask Colin a question, Corinne will moderate the Q&A through the chat box. And now please welcome Rotarian and immediate past president, Kate Ertman, as today's chair of the day. Kate?
Thank you, President Ruth, and good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. I'm quite honored that I get to introduce our speaker this week. Colin Fogarty has always been drawn to the notion that we are surrounded by history and that it is up to us to see it. As a public radio journalist at Oregon Public Broadcasting, his stories were heard frequently on NPR, and he won regional and national awards. He covered state and regional politics, Oregon's landmark Death with Dignity law, the bankruptcy of the Archdiocese of Portland, and many other issues. Along the way, Colin kept returning to the theme of history and its role in our everyday lives. In February 2014, he became executive director of Confluence, a community-supported nonprofit with the mission to connect people to the history, living cultures, and ecology of the Columbia River system through Indigenous voices. In his role there, Colin continues to help tell compelling stories about history, not on the radio, but in the landscape, in schools, in communities, and online. Colin and his wife, Stephanie Wyant, have 3 children and live in Portland. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Portland, Colin.
Well, thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Siobhan and Corinne, for putting this all together and making sure that it all comes together on a technical way. I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see that okay? Am I doing all right? Okay. And I also just want to say, just very briefly, you know, I'm sorry to say I'm not a Rotarian, but I've been to many Rotary Club meetings over the years, first as a reporter, but then, you know, talking to Rotary clubs about Confluence. And one thing that I've always been really impressed with is just the community orientation of the Rotary Club, so consistently and so historically. You know, I mean, we've all heard, you know, the concept of bowling alone, and how, you know, in America we've lost these civic groups and these civic gathering places, even bowling alleys, where people of all kinds just get together and talk about things in a nonpartisan way. And I just really appreciate that about the Rotary Club. And it's one thing that I think drew me to Confluence, is that, you know, it's not Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative. It's just getting outside of the, you know, history has a way of being honest and keeping us honest, and getting outside of the ruts of normal civic conversation. So so I really do appreciate the Rotary Club, and I want to just thank you for inviting me here. So as you heard Kate say, Confluence's mission is to connect people with the history and living cultures and ecology of the Columbia River system through Indigenous voices. And as I was a reporter and an editor, I was always drawn to stories about the Columbia River, and particularly about the Indigenous history of the Columbia River. But more deeply, and I think this is a theme that you'll see throughout this presentation, but also all of our work at Confluence, is the stories that are there for us to pay attention to, but we don't see, we don't talk about. It's the story that has always been there, but is not necessarily noticed. And those are the stories that I was always drawn to in as a reporter and a journalist. But you know, at Confluence, the basic idea of the Indigenous story of the Columbia River and the place that we live, it's just not something we ever learned in school, and it's not something that is really represented fully in the media and in history books. And I'll tell you, you know, at some point in the presentation, I'll talk about the public events that we have. And inevitably, when we have these public gatherings, someone raises their hand at the end to say, I've learned more about Native history and culture here in an hour than I've learned in 17 years of schooling or 12 years of schooling. And so that's part of what drew me to Confluence. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the origins of Confluence, where we came from, the artwork by Maya Lin, and how we've evolved into an education organization and a community organization where we have these community events, and also our digital library that we've really been working on over the last few years to build as a resource for students and teachers and anyone who is really curious about the Columbia River system. So Confluence began in 2002 as a response to the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. And it really began with this man, Antone Minthorn, who at the time was the chair of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Eastern Oregon. And there was a lot of discussion among tribal communities about how to approach, or even whether to participate in the Lewis and Clark bicentennial, because they certainly weren't going to make it a celebration. But Antone Minthorn felt that the Lewis and Clark bicentennial offered an opportunity to get the tribal story out there. That the idea was that Lewis and Clark didn't discover the Columbia River. Lewis and Clark visited the Columbia River. And when they visited, they met people. And his point was the descendants of the people Lewis and Clark met are still here, thank you very much. And they have a story to tell. And to him, it was not a story about loss. Certainly it was a story about loss, but not only a story about loss and destruction. To him, it was a story about resilience, because if you've been to Pendleton and Umatilla County and the Umatilla Reservation anytime in the last few years, you'll see that the Umatilla tribe is the biggest employer in that whole area, and has become a real economic force in Eastern Oregon. And unlike some company from out of state, they're not going anywhere. They've been here for at least 16,000 years and they're not leaving. So, and that was his point. He wanted that story to be told and to be part of the Lewis and Clark bicentennial. And meanwhile, Confluence's founding director, Jane Jacobson, really felt also that that artwork needed to be part of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. Artwork built into the landscape to remind people of this history. So independently on their own, Jane and Antone had the same idea to approach this woman, if I can get my, there we go, Maya Lin, to become involved. And Maya Lin, as you may know, is best known as the designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which she did as a 21-year-old student at Yale. And, you know, Maya was not especially interested in commemorating Lewis and Clark, certainly not celebrating Lewis and Clark. And there's a famous quote in a newspaper that Jane made, or didn't inadvertently, or didn't mean to. A reporter was saying, well, what is this artwork going to be? What's gonna, you know, what's Maya Lin gonna design? And this was in the early phases. And Jane was like, we don't know, we're not sure, we're doing research, there's a lot of discussion, we're not sure, but what's it really gonna be? And finally, Jane said, well, I don't know what it's gonna be, but I can tell you what it's not gonna be. It's not gonna be a statue of two white men pointing west, right? And Maya was certainly not interested in that kind of story, but what she was interested in is two things. One is the cultural story of the Columbia River being indigenous land, not discovered. But she was also interested in the ecological story. How has this river been transformed over the last 200 years? And by exploring that, what does that tell us about our values and how we're treating the environment, but also what does that mean for the next 200 years? So she was interested in Confluence as a way to explore looking backwards, as a way to instead look to a different future. In other words, the story isn't that Lewis and Clark discovered the Columbia River. The story is that Lewis and Clark took really good notes. And we can use those notes, those journals, as a way of seeing what the landscape and what the people of the Columbia River system looked like 200 years ago. And for Antone, that 200 years translated into 7 generations, right? And it's a native value to make decisions based on what impact you are having 7 generations from now. And his point was Lewis and Clark, their impact, their legacy, we're seeing today. We see that surrounding. So they're surrounding us right now. So what is our legacy today, and what choices are we making today, and what impact will that have 7 generations from now? So they all agreed on the notion of confluence. So just really briefly, and I will go through all of these sites. This is a map of the confluence site. So if you see on the left side of your screen is the mouth of the Columbia River. Cape Disappointment was the first site. And then as you make your way east, you see the Vancouver Land Bridge and the bird blind at the Sandy River Delta. Farther east, the 4th site was the Story Circles at Sacagawea State Park in Pasco, Washington, and that is the confluence of the Snake and the Columbia Rivers. And then the farthest easternmost site is at a place called Chief Timothy Park along the Snake River at the confluence of the Snake and a place called Alpoe Creek. So you notice that all of these sites are some kind of confluence, right? And that's where the name came from. But as time went on, the name confluence also took on a deeper meaning and a metaphor that the story of the Columbia River system is not fundamentally one about discovery. The story is about confluence, about people coming together and histories coming together and ecologies coming together. And so each one of these sites was chosen because of its cultural and historical significance to tribes. And those also tended to be confluences because those, remember, were the highways of the time. You know, in a canoe culture, people gathered at confluences of rivers, that's where those were the most significant sites. So I'm just going to go through each one of these sites just really briefly to talk a little bit about the artistic elements of it, and then we can talk about education after that. So let's move on from here. So Cape Disappointment, which in my mind is the worst named state park in America. I can assure you it is not a disappointing place to visit. But it is a series of artworks throughout the state park. And you see on the left-hand side is a fish cleaning table. It's a solid slab of basalt that's been polished down, and etched into the basalt is the Chinookan creation story, which instructs you on the proper way of filleting a salmon. And when you think about this, and it's a working fish cleaning table. So as you come off the bay with your salmon that you've caught in the Columbia River or in the ocean, you can take that salmon and fillet it and clean it right there on this work of art. And you were reminded that Chinookan peoples have been doing that same very act in that very same place for at least 16,000 years. And that is a connection to history and place that, in other words, you know, what Maya likes to talk about is that the artwork isn't the artwork itself, it's the place. And she's hoping to connect you more deeply to the place itself. So when you see the second part of the art installation at Cape Disappointment is a platform. And many people go there and they say, is this a work of art? It's just a platform along the river. It's beautiful, but is it art? And her point there is that it is a place to examine the bay, the estuary where the Columbia River meets and mingles with the salt water of the ocean. And again, it's the artwork is the place itself. It's an invitation to connect with the place in a way that you might not have otherwise. So the Confluence Land Bridge at Fort Vancouver is the only site, the only Confluence site that is not designed by Maya Lin. She consulted and was part of the conversation, but the land bridge is actually a bridge over, it's a footbridge over Highway 14. So it had to be done by an architect. And in this case, that architect was John Paul Jones, who is not the bass player of Led Zeppelin, but instead is a very prominent architect in Seattle, and he's native. And the land bridge includes artworks by the Warm Springs artist Lillian Pitt. And again, its purpose is to connect you with the indigenous history of that place. You know, Fort Vancouver, of course, is known as the birthplace of is where the Hudson's Bay Company located in 1826, and it was the seat of British colonial power in the western, what's now the Western United States, but at that time was not at all clear was going to be part of the United States. And that history is well documented, and there's a replica of the fort there, and you can explore Fort Vancouver, and I really encourage you to, because it's a really historical place. It's one of the richest archaeological sites in the Northwest. But, you know, the Hudson's Bay Company, they weren't dumb. They located it there because there were already plains there, and it was a trading area for Chinookan peoples along the Columbia River. It had long been a trading area, so it seemed like a perfect spot for them to locate the Hudson's Bay Company. And the land bridge is an attempt to really reconnect people with the native plants and agriculture that happened there by, you know, harvesting camas and wapato, but it's also a reminder of the indigenous history of that place, not just the colonial history. So the Confluence Bird Blind at the Sandy River Delta in Troutdale is, you know, it's a park that a lot of people know as Thousand Acres Park, and it's on just off exit 18, just past the Troutdale stores that are there, the outlet stores. That's the word I was looking for. And the bird blind is at the end of a 1.2 mile hike, the Confluence Trail. And it's an outdoor room built of black locust wood, and black locust is an invasive species. So Maya did not want to, she wanted to have as little impact on the environment as possible. And using black locust wood is not only a really hard wood, but that lasts a long time, but it's also an invasive species, so it can be harvested sustainably. And in the middle of an outdoor room that is in the shape of an ellipse is a list. Each slat along the wall of the bird blind includes a species that was documented by Lewis and Clark on their westward journey, 120 in all. So you'll see foxes, and you'll see salmon, and lots of birds and different animals. But then also you'll see their for each one of those species, you'll see their environmental status in 2008 when that site was completed. So some of those species are extinct, are threatened, are species of concern. So in the bird blind, you are able to examine the natural world around you without disturbing it, but you're also reminded of the environmental impact of human activity over the last 200 years. So the Confluence Story Circles in Pasco, Washington, again, where the Snake River meets the Columbia River. These are a series of basalt. You know, basalt is the rock of our region, the volcanic rock. And each one of these story circles tells a story about salmon, about coyote, about language, about trading, These are all, again, reminders of the indigenous history of that place. When Lewis and Clark came there, one of my favorite stories is that they were actually disappointed to finally reach the Columbia River. And the reason they were disappointed is that they thought they were already on the Columbia River when they were in fact on the Snake River. So they reached the Columbia River and they're like, oh, I thought we were already here. But it was a really active, cultural, vibrant place. There were thousands of people there at the confluence of the Snake River and the Columbia River. And I really recommend going there. It's in Pasco and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. So the fifth and completed site, confluence site, is the Listening Circle at Chief Timothy Park. And again, it's along the Snake River in Nez Perce homelands. And it's based on a blessing ceremony that happened there led by the Nez Perce spiritual leaders back in 2005. And as that ceremony was assembled, you know, according to Nez Perce custom, the men sat on one side, the women sat on another side. No one had their back to the east, and the elders faced the east, and that way they were able to welcome a new day. And Maya was so struck by that they had created a kind of a spiritual landscape in this ancient, historic, and culturally significant place. And what she wanted to do was build that spiritual landscape into the actual landscape, to remind people that this is Nez Perce land, that this is the homeland of the Namipu, and it always has been. Of all of the confluence sites, the Chief Timothy Park looks the most like what Lewis and Clark described. If you read the Lewis and Clark journals and how they describe that particular place and stretch along the Columbia River, along the Snake River, excuse me, looks pretty much the same. There is a geodesic dome up there on the horizon these days, and that wasn't there back in 1805, but other than some development there, it looks mostly like what Lewis and Clark observed. And in 2015, we were honored to be able to have a blessing or a dedication ceremony there with the Nez Perce tribe. So the sixth and final site, the only one that is not yet completed, is a place called Celilo Park. And if you've heard of Celilo Falls, this is a place along the Columbia River, 11 miles east of the Dalles. Now we're coming back a little bit farther west in the mid-Columbia River region near the Dalles, Oregon. And for those of you who maybe grew up in Oregon, maybe even if we were in person, I would ask everyone who remembers Celilo Falls, who here has visited Celilo Falls, and inevitably someone says yes. And I remember the sound and I remember the smell of fish. And for at least 16,000 years, Celilo Falls was a center of fishing, center of commerce, center of culture, center of spiritual life. We called it the Wall Street of the West. Lewis and Clark called it the Great Mart, because that was where tribes from all over the country gathered, from as far away as Florida and what's now Canada and Alaska and California. There's archaeological evidence that people from all over North America at some point gathered at Celilo Falls. And in 1957, the Dalles Dam went in and closed its gates. And this is what Celilo Falls looks like today. It is a lake. And the roar of the falls, the roar that Lewis and Clark described, has been silenced and replaced by the sound of the freeway. So what Maya Lin has designed is an elevated walkway inspired by the fishing platforms that you would have seen at Celilo Falls. And it is the three purposes of this project are to educate people about Celilo Falls, to honor the indigenous people of the Columbia River, and then also to strengthen the tribal presence in the public spaces along the Columbia River. This is the only project that is not yet complete, and it is currently on hold because there are 4 tribes connected to Celilo Falls, and 3 of them support it, but one of them, the Yakima Nation, does not currently support it. So we're working on that, and I can talk more about that later if you want, but that project is on hold at the moment. So in the meantime, as Confluence developed these projects, it really became clear that there was a real need for education. That people, you know, you heard me talk a little bit about the Chinookan creation story etched into the Confluence fish cleaning table at Cape Disappointment. Well, it kind of loses its power and doesn't have as much of an impact if you don't know anything about the Chinookan people, and you don't know that there's currently a Chinook Indian nation seeking federal recognition now. So Tribal leaders working with us really encouraged Confluence to get into the business of education. And so Confluence in the Classroom is an effort to bring Native artists and educators into schools to do meaningful projects about the Columbia River system. You see on the right, Linda Mianis is a Warm Springs elder who grew up in Celilo Village. When she was 5 years old, there was a book written about her called Linda's Indian Home, about life in Celilo Village, growing up next to Celilo Falls. And today, she's a cancer survivor, a PSU graduate, and a Warm Springs elder, and we pay her to go into classrooms and to teach students about Celilo Falls. And she loves it. She loves telling her story. She loves sharing Native cultures with students. We also do artwork, like on the left-hand side, you can see a mural that went up in middle school in Troutdale with a Yakima artist named Toma Villa. And you see a drumming group at NEA in Portland, the Native American school. So Confluence Outdoors was a natural extension of Confluence in the Classroom because we wanted to get people out to culturally significant places, to some of our sites, but also places like Columbia Hills State Park on the Washington side of the Columbia River, where you can see the famous petroglyph, She Who Watches. And so we connect students and teachers with Indigenous artists and culture bearers and tradition keepers. So, and now in COVID times, of course, we're doing this online. So it's the Confluence, it's not Confluence in the classroom, it's a Confluence virtual classroom. And as challenging as this time has been, the flip side and the upside is that we have been able to reach more schools, more students, and have a greater, wider impact than we have otherwise because we're able to do these things virtually. So along the way, one thing that we heard from teachers, but also from tribal leaders, is that, you know, teachers need help. Like they, like most Americans, really don't know a whole lot themselves about Native history and culture, but also they're scared, right? There's a real fear among teachers about how to do this appropriately. Like, who do I talk to and how do I bring Native voices into schools? So we started doing a series of professional development workshops for teachers, and that has really increased tremendously. And of course, we do that online now. And again, we're able to reach far more teachers than we have otherwise. And we're super excited this year because we just got a grant from the Oregon Department of Education to do a series of workshop cohorts virtually all around the state of Oregon. So we are super excited about that because it comes at a time when teachers and schools are implementing new state requirements to include Native education in their curriculum. So teachers need help as they go on this journey themselves. Inevitably, when I talk about these education programs, someone says to me like, hey, it would be really great if you could do that for adults. So that basic notion gave birth to a program that we call Confluence in the Community, and specific programs that we call Confluence Story Gatherings. So it has two meanings. We are gathered to hear stories, but we are gathering stories too. And again, these are panel discussions with Indigenous writers and thinkers and leaders sharing their wisdom, talking about the issues of the day and giving their perspective. And these are the events that I talked about where at the end somebody says, oh my God, I've learned more here in an hour than I ever knew about Indigenous approaches to ecology and to pieces of our history that are just not taught. So, and of course, we do this online now. And again, we're able to reach more people. We have these events. And in fact, we have a whole series of events coming up beginning this Thursday. And I can tell you more about that. And you can find a calendar of events coming up on our website, confluenceproject.org. So as we have, and I'm looking at the time too. Am I doing okay? It's 12:47. So I'm going to quicken the pace here and go reach the end as quick as I can. But you know, public art needs tender loving care. Like you can't just build this and walk away. You have to take care of them. So we have volunteer events to conserve the artwork. We also, you know, have insurance policies on each one of these. So a lot of what we do is really sort of take care of these artworks. And here is you know, one of the last volunteer events that we had at the Confluence Land Bridge. We had another one of these mulch parties and cleanup events planned for April of 2020. And of course, we had to cancel that But then in this fall, we had a whole series of smaller volunteer events for people to spread mulch and clean up the land bridge and really sort of give back and have a hand in preserving this artwork. So as we have gone along, one of the things that we have really discovered is that there is information out there about the indigenous history of the Columbia River system, but people just don't have access to it. It's not necessarily all in one place. There are lots of different tribes, lots of different libraries, lots of different books. So Confluence Online is a digital library for teachers and students and anyone who is curious to know more. These are, of course, you see on the right a picture of Celilo Falls, fishing at Celilo Falls, but these are, they call these the little rascals of Celilo Village in the 1940s. But there are photo galleries and interviews and documentary shorts that we have done. And in fact, the event that we're doing on Thursday is the latest in our series of documentary shorts. This one is called Salmon's Agreement. And the person on the left you see there is our filmmaker Woodrow Hunt, and he is Native himself, and he is the producer of these documentaries. So Confluence Online is a real resource of all of these different digital forms for people to learn more about the history, the living cultures, and the ecology of the Columbia River system. So that's really about Confluence and the history of our work and what we do here. And so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Colin, thank you so much. We do have at least one question waiting in the chat. For all of you, if you have a question, just say, as John White did, that he has a question, and Corinne will call on you and manage the Q&A. Corinne?
Okay, first we have Tamara Brown.
Hi, thank you so much for this information.
Sure.
I didn't know about your organization and everything that you did. I'm so excited about it. Do you work with Naya and a lot of the other Native tribes already? So do they know about you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they do. So we've worked with Naya a number of years. We've had Confluence in the classroom and just brought, we support their work, right? So what we do is bring Native artists and educators into the school there. But we're also working with them right now on a grant from Metro to do Confluence Outdoors. And it's essentially field trips to the Sandy River Delta with kids from NAIA, but then also Title VI is the federal, Native education, Native student program. And so in Hillsborough and Beaverton, there are Title VI programs where they have about 60 or 70 Native kids in the district, and they get them together and they do programs. So we're working with them to get those kids out to the Sandy River Delta.
That makes me so happy. I've been working with a woman who's in charge at Clackamas School District, and she's in charge of trying to make sure that the health of the natives there, to try to bring up the graduation rate for the students there. I would, if you're not connected with the Clackamas School District, I think this would be like so awesome for her to work with you guys and on that, because it'll be good for the students. I don't know if you
Absolutely.
know.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Because it actually, these programs really do, it's true. Like, I wish that there was some sort of scientific, like systematic way that we do this, but it really is personal connections. And I'm going to, in the chat, I'm going to put the name of our education manager.
Yay.
And I will share my contact information too. And anyway, I can't type. I'll type it in when I'm not talking. But yeah, absolutely, to be able to get her connected with someone in Clackamas, like that would be awesome. Thank you.
Great. Our second question is John White.
Hi, Colin. Thanks for your presentation. I visited most of these facilities you've talked about. I live near the land bridge crossing over 14. And maybe my experience is different, but I'd like to ask you, I take visitors there frequently. I just think it's fascinating, and there's a lot of material there about the tribes and what it was like. And I'm always surprised at how uninterested a lot of people are in this. I wonder if you find the same thing. I mean, I have some theories about it, but there really is a lot of history in this region in general that a lot of people just don't seem to care about. And I wonder if you run into that or if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, that's a really, and thank you. Thank you for visiting the land bridge, and thank you for bringing people there. I should mention, and I thought you were going to say, you really need to do a better job with maintenance, because it's true. Because there are potholes in the pathway, and we're really self-conscious about that. And I should tell you that the city of Vancouver is embarking on, it's a huge project, the land bridge. And so we're a small nonprofit, like we can't really keep up with a lot of the maintenance, but the city of Vancouver does. And they're planning a huge refurbishment to just repave the whole thing with pavers to really improve the pathway there. It's interesting. On the one hand, we see a real hunger, invitations for talks like this, schools and teachers and organizations are really, really interested. And we've particularly seen a major increase in demand and interest in what we're doing over the last year, in part because I think of frankly, the historical reckoning that America is going through right now because of what happened to George Floyd and all of these subsequent events. There is a real recognition, at least we see a real tangible recognition that a lot of people need to do a lot of work. And in so many ways, it begins with relearning our history and reevaluating our relationship with our history. And we try to do that as an invitation. Like we're not out there protesting. We are inviting people to learn more and to educate themselves. But on the other hand, you remind me of a conversation that I had with someone where it was a stranger that I met and I was chatting with, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said this, and he said, "Really? There's an organization devoted to this? And people donate to it?" Like he was really befuddled by the whole thing. Like, wow, that's interesting. I would never have thought that. So I do think that, it took generations and generations and generations to establish the understanding of America that we have. And it will take generations and generations and generations for that to change over time. So yeah, but thank you for your interest.
Our next question is Chris Ackerman.
So I have a strange question. The modern tribes are often conglomerations of historical tribes. In other words, what we call the Warm Springs is actually more than one tribe. And one of the stories that isn't well told is who were the tribes and where were they and what were they doing in the historical Columbia River region and also in the Willamette Valley. And the tribes in the Columbia have been better preserved, if you will, than those in the Willamette, who were largely destroyed by smallpox and things before the pioneers ever got here. But and I have some knowledge of that, but it's not as complete as I would like it to be. And sort of, I'm sure that resource is out there, but how do you find it?
Yeah, well, and that's a big question. And I mean, we do hope that our library can be a resource for that, that's accessible. There are real books that are important books. And I should say I'm not a historian. One place that I would really recommend is a website by an Oregon State University professor who's also a Grand Ronde tribal member. His name is David Lewis. And I think his website is Indian Research History, and it's NDN, right? Indian, NDN. But if you just Google David Lewis, you might be able to find it. He's a real he really documents a lot of the firsthand accounts of tribes. But you're exactly right, and it's one of the things, one of the first principles of understanding Indigenous history of the Columbia River is that there was no one. There were plateau peoples. There were Chinookan peoples, but there was no one tribe. There was no Navajo nation or Cherokee nation. It was all like the power structure never rose above the village chief. And so the consequences of that you see every day today, because even doing a land acknowledgement in the boundaries of Portland is really complicated, because there's so many people who really sort of claim this area as territory, but even that is just a colonial construct that we impose. And it's extremely complicated, and the cultures are extremely diverse. And so, I guess the thing I would say is, my own journey on that is just learning one new thing at a time. Like every time we do an event, every time I talk to a Native elder or listen to one of our interviews, I learn something new. And it's a lot.
One of the things you could do that would be interesting would be to go through all the words we use in the Northwest and tell us which tribes they came from. I mean, a lot of them are names, but there are actually words that we use all the time that we don't know came from the natives. And that would be an interesting thing to sort of spring on people. You're speaking a native language every day.
I think that's a really good suggestion. And things like Tualatin and Clackamas and Multnomah, these were all specific Chinookan bands. But the sort of the flip side of that too is a challenge. And I won't go on about this, but one thing is, so they changed the name of Mount McKinley in Alaska to Denali, right, to reflect the Alaskan Native people. Well, hey, let's do the same thing for Mount Hood, right? I mean, Admiral Hood didn't even come here. Why do we call this mountain after a British sailor that had no connection here? But the idea of renaming Mount Hood, I think, would be extremely divisive among tribes, because there are so many different names for Mount Hood. I mean, the most common, and there's also myths. I learned that the native word for Mount Hood is Wyeast. Well, no, it's not actually true. That was invented by an American novelist. That's not even the name. And Pato is the most common name, but that's what people at Warm Springs call it, but people in Yakima call it something different, and people in Grand Ronde have a different name for it. So it's complicated.
It is complicated. And with that thought, we're going to have to close the questions. Colin, thank you so much. All of those questions were so thoughtful. And you can tell when a presentation has really resonated by how people think about it and ask about it after. Next week, we have a contrast to today. After thinking about the beautiful outdoors, we will hear from Dr. Doreen McGee on the psychological effects of screen time. This message will once again be live via Zoom at noon on Tuesday. I want to thank everyone who came today. I so appreciate it. And Drew, thank you for that quote and your reflection. Mari, we appreciate your overview of the Enterprise Academy. And Kate, thank you for your speaker introduction. Colin, thank you again for your fascinating presentation. As the weather improves and vaccinations take hold, you've given us multiple opportunities to explore the Columbia Gorge as both a physical and spiritual destination. Now, as we enter into a new Rotary week, please join me in opening the doors of opportunity for healing, for recovery, and for peace building. As Rotarians, we are here to make our world healthier, more sustainable, and with justice for all. With that, have a great week, everyone. And this meeting is adjourned.